Hello, good evening, good morning, whatever time it is when you finally watch this. This is the video for the week of April 6th. The topic is the 20s, the 1920s, because we have to be specific now, because we're in our own 20s now. I'll tell you the weird thing about the 1920s, it also started with a global pandemic. So maybe history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. All right, so with last week, you hopefully have watched Inherit the Wind, and that is a fictionalized account of something that happened in the 1920s in Tennessee, and we'll be talking about this in this lecture. I don't know exactly how many videos this will be. I'm going to probably try to keep it to one unless it gets to be really long. I know you guys don't particularly like videos that last too long. By the way, I will also be including yet another supplemental section with a few videos in there. Some of them are pretty long, actually. But the thing about the supplemental videos is they are there for you if you want to watch them. I highly recommend them. If you got the time, please do. Figure we all might have some extra time on our hands with this, situation going on. All right, let's talk about the 1920s. An interesting decade. It was a car decade. Car registrations in 1920 were 9.2 million cars on the road. By 1930, that number went to 26.5 million. Big cities actually saw this as an environmental win because they had to deal with smelly horse trouble leading up to that time. The car was actually seen as a clean solution to that particular problem. Paving streets also got rid of a lot of dust and mud. We also have in the 20s tractors, which will help farmers. Families would often pack into their cars and they would travel into town on Saturdays. How much did a car cost? Between 20 to 45% of a non-farmer's annual income. For a farmer, it was between 50 and 100% of their annual income. How were cars bought? Well, this is actually the beginnings of our consumer credit culture. Credit plans were offered. Usually you would pay 1/3 down, and then you would pay the rest of the payments over the course of the year, usually with a big interest rate, sometimes with a balloon payment at the end. This was obviously a boom for the petroleum industry. New oil wells in Texas and California, as many people will now begin to move to the suburbs even more now that they have the cars. They don't have to catch a train. They can drive back and forth to work. This meant that the government needed to begin to build tunnels and bridges. In 1927, the Holland Tunnel was the first underwater tunnel in this country connecting New York and New Jersey for some reason. On the first day, 50,000 cars lined up, paying 50 cents to drive through the tunnel. That's actually a pretty expensive toll. The last time I was on a toll road, it had 3 tolls on it, and 50 cents was actually the most expensive one. That was a few years back, though. Government cars will also lead to more people going on vacation. The government began to build and pave more and more roads. This led to food, lodging, and gas places dispersed along the highway. They will use catchy advertising jingles to get business. Let me show you an example. A couple of examples right here. First of all, down there is that was a Cottage gas station. Isn't that cute? I think my favorite is this one. This was the teapot gas stations, made just like a teapot, named after the Teapot Dome. which will be a major scandal during the Warren G. Harding administration. Now, the 1920s on the surface seemed like it was a decade where everything was going right. However, if you kind of scratch the surface a little bit, you could see that there were the underlying problems that would lead to the Great Depression. Um, one thing I forgot to mention with these different businesses along the way, they would often use catchy advertising to get businesses, like a series of signs spaced a mile apart that says 10 miles to the world's greatest chili, 9 miles to some chili, you hungry, things like that. So what's the 1920s like for workers? Well, after the war, the government canceled most of their contracts, which was actually kind of a bad idea. They should have kind of slowly divested, so to not cause the economic problems that would come. Businesses basically returned to the way they had been actually before the progressive era. Industrialists could now attack labor unions, not just for being socialists, but for actually being communists, because you now have the communists in charge of Russia. The two presidents in the 1920s will be Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. They were extremely conservative. They wanted to let business do pretty much whatever they wanted. And the Justice Department stopped enforcing antitrust laws. Now, industrialists will begin to offer fringe benefits, things like a pension after 25 years of work. Some will even offer stock options. This was called actually at the time welfare capitalism, which means something totally different today. To me, welfare capitalism today is when we keep giving subsidies to like the oil industry who make billions of dollars. This was something different. However, it was kind of a show, meaning that, they're going to say, oh, yeah, you can buy some stock options. Or, yeah, we'll give you some paid vacation or something like that. But you have to work for a certain number of years before you can get any benefits. And seasonal layoffs still happened, and every time you got laid off, you basically had to start over if you got rehired. And generally, you had to wait years for that paid vacation. You had to work long hours, and generally you'd get laid off before any of the benefits would take hold. This will lead to a time of increased industrial productivity, which led to a lot of cheaper goods. As I mentioned before, this is the beginnings of our consumer culture. We begin to use credit to buy more things. Probably one of the most important things to come from this era was the radio. Radio will help to create a national culture. I probably mentioned before, one of my favorite stations on the satellite radio is called Radio Classics, which has all the old dramas and science fiction and comedy shows from the not really from the 1920s, because they didn't really have the ability to keep those and record a lot of those, but just those shows from the radio. And it is going to be so important in creating a national culture. 60% of homes will have a radio in them in the 1920s. After 1924, you no longer needed to have headsets or, headsets to actually listen to the radio, which now, of course, I wish more people would use headsets when listening to the radio. But so after 1924, the family could actually gather around the radio together. The radio is where you learned about elections, you listened to baseball, you enjoyed entertainment programs. Babe Ruth will become a national hero during this time because the Yankees, for reasons past the understanding, I hate the Yankees, were played nationally on the radio, I guess is the best way to put it. So Babe Ruth becomes a national hero. He was drunk most of the time. You've heard the term soap opera probably wondered where it came from. Well, soap operas actually began on the radio. They were dramatic shows on the radio, and some of the first sponsors of those were Walgreens, Palmolive Soap, and other big companies that sponsored them. So you got the term soap opera because, a lot of those shows were sponsored by like detergent and soap and things. So that's where that came from. You also had local radio designed for certain groups. This was also the beginnings of the silent film era. So that's one thing that people would get into their cars and take their family to see silent shows, Charlie Chaplin, that kind of thing. Now, one of the great heroes of the era, and I'm including a biography of him. So I'm going to briefly talk about him here. If you want to know more, watch that video. Charles Lindbergh, who will usher in a new era of flight. The Spirit of St. Louis was the name of his plane. He had the first nonstop flight from New York to Paris, and he flew without radio or radar. He used instruments and basically looked out the window. The flight lasted 33 and a half hours. Don't ask about going to the bathroom. As a result of that, he became a national hero. There's actually a movie called The Spirit of St. Louis, starring Jimmy Stewart, that's kind of interesting. He actually started air mail for the U.S. Postal Service as well. He will become an advocate for commercial air travel. In the 1930s, his firstborn son will be kidnapped and murdered, so that's very sad. Then after that, he started to openly admire the Nazis. He did, however, change his position after Pearl Harbor, and he flew combat missions against the Japanese, and he was an anti-communist crusader in the 1950s. Again, if you want to know more, check out the biography I'm going to include. What's interesting about Lindbergh is, you hear that saying, if you live long enough, you'll see yourself become the villain. Well, he lived long enough not only to see him, he became a hero, a tragic figure, a villain, and then a hero again. So that's kind of the trajectory of his life. Now, you may remember I talked about a lost generation at the end of the war. That really refers a lot to the people who came of age during this time. It refers to those who came out of World War I as kind of their formative experience. Many had died. This generation tended to fight against the repressive codes of conduct that they believe that society forced upon them. Many will adopt a hedonistic lifestyle. Ernest Hemingway is probably the best example of this if you kind of look at the way that he lived his life. But, if you think about it, if you go through the horrors of World War I, if you see your friends die, you probably are going to kind of rebel against the society around you. We'll see this in full force when we begin talking about our lead up to World War II. Not next week. Next week will be the Great Depression and the New Deal. But then after that, we're going to start ramping up for World War II. Another thing that begins during this period is Prohibition. I'm also going to include a video for that as well. Temperance became a big deal during World War I as they accused German breweries of making men ineffective and stupid. Well, I don't think American men needed any help with that. One of the advocates of Prohibition was an awesomely named preacher named Billy Sunday, who began to condemn churchgoers for drinking and really push for temperance. He was a big deal. He was a former baseball player, became a born-again Christian, and he often dined at the White House and was a friend of John Rockefeller. On December 18th, I guess? I may be wrong about that. In December of 1917, Congress approved the 18th Amendment. It was ratified on January 16, 1919. Only 2 states, Rhode Island and Connecticut, voted against it, but they are out of luck. Alcohol was now banned. Now, this is going to shock you. Congress passes this amendment, sends it off to the states, but actually wasn't prepared to really define what prohibition was. So Congress has to hastily pass what is called the Volstead Act, which will basically define what an alcoholic beverage is. And it said anything with more than 0.5% alcohol was banned. Heck, that's some near beer today. That's NyQuil. You couldn't take NyQuil anymore. There will never be enough money for enforcement. The well-off just made their own. This led to the rise of organized crime, which frankly almost brought down the city of Chicago. The most famous was probably Al Capone. You've probably heard of him. He was the most powerful in the Chicago underground. In 1929, he orchestrated what was called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And this shows you the power that he had. He was able to get hold of police uniforms and a paddy wagon. And what he did is he went around and arrested his competitors and then took them and lined them up against the wall and shot them execution style. That's how powerful he was. A few years later, 1931, he will go to prison, but it will be for tax evasion, not for the terrible, terrible murders. Speakeasies will pop up all over the country. There were enforcement agents who would try to go around the country and shut them down. One was awesomely named Izzy Einstein. That's Izzy Einstein. Why is he interesting? That's because he kept a diary of how long it took him to find alcohol from the moment he arrived in a city. For instance, in Chicago, it took him 21 minutes. In New Orleans, this probably isn't a surprise to anyone, it took him 31 seconds to find illegal alcohol. Now, why did it take that long? Well, basically what he would do is he would get in a cab and he'd say, "Hey, buddy, I'm new in town. That was a long flight or whatever. Can you tell me where I can get some beer or something to drink?" Well, the cabbie in New Orleans opened up the glove box and said, "Here you go." So 31 seconds. He will shut down 4,000 speakeasies. The big problem with prohibition is it now became cool to drink. You know how it is when you're told not to do something. It's the only thing that you want to do. Some claim that prohibition led to an economic boom that was happening. Obviously, when the Great Depression hit, you couldn't argue that anymore. It will last till 1939 when the 21st Amendment will repeal prohibition. And like I said, I am going to include a video or two actually about prohibition so that you can kind of get into that a little bit more if you want to. It's actually a very interesting topic. And of course, if you got questions, make sure you ask about them on the discussion board. All right, so this was also the time of the Red Scare. We had about one of those every 20 years where we were afraid of communism. Now, this is a time where over 1 million immigrants were coming to the United States up until World War I. After that, less than 200,000. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Immigration Act, temporarily allowing 350,000 European immigrants into the country and began setting limits on each country. This is where we get our quota system, and it was actually based on, honestly, a very flawed view of eugenics. It was actually very racist. It will become permanent with the Immigration Act of 1924. However, we still, and this will surprise you, given the current climate, we still allowed unrestricted immigration from within the Western Hemisphere. So we allow people from Mexico and the Caribbean and Canada and our side of the world to come freely. We did stop all Asian immigrants. We talked about that before. We will at first allow a total of 185,000 European immigrants and then reduce it to 150,000 soon after that. More were allowed from Northern Europe. As I said, racism played a role. Germany actually received the highest quota, believe it or not. we were very concerned about the Russian Revolution. The Justice Department arrested and deported alien anarchists and communists. Anarchists were actually probably the biggest problem. After all, there are no anarchy meetings that you can spy on. You can spy on communists. Anarchists tended to believe that all government was corrupt and they used violence to try to get their way. One example is they set off dynamite in front of the house of the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. So this is a time where we're really trying to crack down on immigration. Again, kind of sounds familiar. Now, I want to talk about Christian fundamentalism, which was actually kind of what was going on with the movie you watched last week. Christian fundamentalists were upset about Darwin's theory of evolution, and the World Christian Fundamentalists Association lobbied schools to prohibit the teaching of evolution. In 1925, Tennessee made it a crime to teach evolution. The ACLU saw it as a violation of the First Amendment and offered to help any teacher who challenged it. Civic boosters in Dayton, Tennessee wanted the notoriety, so in a way it was kind of a setup. Everybody was kind of in on it. So they got John Scopes, a 24-year-old science teacher and part-time football coach, because he's in Tennessee and you got to be a part-time football coach, taught evolution and was arrested. Well, this thing gets out of hand in a hurry. William Jennings Bryan, who played Colonel Brady in the movie, who was Colonel Brady in the movie, agrees to come in and help prosecute the case. So that's going to bring headlines. The ACLU hired the best lawyer of the day, a man named Clarence Darrow, that's Drummond in the movie, to argue for the defense. Hundreds of journalists came to Dayton, Tennessee. It's Dayton, Tennessee, not Hillsborough. And it was built publicly as the Scopes monkey trials. H.L. Mencken, a reporter, who was, the reporter in the movie, always called the fundamentalists hillbillies and yokels. Soon you had a very carnival-like atmosphere with revival meetings, using even trained chimpanzees to mock the evolutionists, and they sold quite a few monkey dolls. So, in fact, let me show you that. Here's a little girl holding her monkey doll from the Scopes trial. Now, hopefully you understand the Scopes trial from reading the article from the Time. Bryan argued that the Tennessee legislature could pass any law that the majority favored. Darrow said that it violated the Constitution because it made Christianity the official faith of the state. And believe it or not, Darrow actually got Bryan on the witness stand and got him to admit that he did not think that the entire Bible could be taken literally. That scene from the movie is fairly accurate as to what happened. Now, the trial will kind of abruptly end, mainly because it wasn't going very well for anybody. Bryan did want to actually get Darrow on the stand, but he was not able to do so. So Scopes will be convicted. He will be fined $100 by the judge. The ACLU then appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court. It'll be overturned on a technicality because it was supposed to be the jury that gave out the punishment and not the judge. And so the law itself was never actually challenged. Tennessee doesn't repeal the law until 1967. And Bryan will actually die in his home 5 days later. A lot of it really was kind of stuff he shouldn't have been eating. You know how that is. So this is an argument that we still are having today. Now, one thing that I would be showing you is an episode of a Adult Swim cartoon called Harvey Birdman, which actually looked at kind of evolution. I think it's called Evolutionary Wars or something like that. It's still with us today. It's the question of intelligent design or creationism, and the argument now is that it should be taught alongside science, which I don't think we got enough time to teach science as it is. Now I fully support. I think that we should have comparative religion classes because that's actually very interesting. But creationism, I don't think is science. Feel free to tell me how wrong I am in the comments. So I do hope that you enjoyed the movie. I'm actually looking forward to reading your discussion board comments about Inherit the Wind. It's one of my favorite movies. My senior year in high school, we read it in one of my English classes. I was the only one who got to play the same part every day, and I loved it. I got to be Colonel Brady. Such a larger-than-life character. All right, so switching gears. The 1920s will also be a time of great racial violence, and we'll see the beginnings of the civil rights movement. Let me show you what I think is one of the most disturbing pictures in any textbook that I've ever had. So, what's going on in that picture? Well, that is a lynching. And that is a place called Marion, Indiana. And not only did that picture get taken, it was sold as a postcard. And what always bugged me about that picture is the way that people are mugging for the camera, like looking up and smiling and all of that. It's just so disgusting. Lynching was a problem. Lynch mobs killed almost 5,000 people from 1880 to 1930. And when I say mostly African Americans. Put it another way, 2 per week. The picture in the book was, as I mentioned, a postcard from Marion, Indiana. Many people kept souvenirs, jewelry off the bodies, even cutting into the bodies to keep body parts. Usually it was after some trumped up charges against African Americans. One of the worst instances was called the Red Summer of 1919, where 43 African Americans were actually killed. There was organized violence to hurt African Americans economically, attacking black businesses and the members of the middle class. In 1921, homes in Tulsa were attacked, as were homes in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. How bad was it in Tulsa? Well, the day of the lynching and the attacks, the Tulsa newspaper ran a headline called, and it said, quote, "To lynch a Negro tonight." That's how bad it was. That's how everybody was in on it. In both places, African Americans did fight back. This angered the white crowds, and they basically burnt the African American communities to the ground. Tulsa declared martial law and imprisoned half of the black community in internment camps. After that, 1,000 families were forced to live in tents throughout the winter before they could rebuild their community the following spring. In 1994, after the Rosewood incident in Florida, Florida actually apologized, Florida doing something right, and gave the survivors $150,000 each. Now, the NAACP, and by 1994, not a whole lot of survivors were left, but it's a good thought. Now, the NAACP wanted to make lynching a federal crime. Southern congressmen continually blocked it. We finally actually do have a anti-lynching federal law, and it was actually, I thought it had been signed months ago. It was actually just recently signed. So there you go. It was generally Southern congressmen who blocked this. And their argument was that it impeded states' rights and the ability of local law enforcement to do their own thing. So, another thing in the 1920s is the return of the KKK. Now, if you remember, the original Klan started in Tennessee, Nathan Bedford Forrest. We talked about it. Well, the original Klan had pretty much been stomped out, but in the 1920s it comes back. And the state where it really comes back surprises some people, and that is the state of Indiana. This is where the KKK has this largest chapter in 1920. In fact, in Indiana, half of the white population actually belonged to the KKK. Indiana, by the way, was a state that had a black population of about 3%. You will see the KKK, which reemerged in the 1910s. In all areas of the country, they will have 3 to 6 million members throughout the 20s. They wanted Protestant supremacy, and they marched under a banner that said 100% Americanism. In 1925, the Klan wanted to march on Washington, D.C. Obviously, the leaders in D.C. did not want that, so they passed a law that said if they were going to march, they couldn't wear hoods. In fact, the Klan is the reason why adults can't wear a mask in Halloween in some places. They thought that by saying they couldn't wear their hoods, the KKK would say, well, we're not going to come because we don't want people to know who we are. Well, they came anyway. They were proud. It's much like those tiki torch guys a couple of years ago. You remember those fools who, were out there chanting, Jews will not replace us. They're basically the new Klan. Then they were shocked when there were repercussions when some of them got fired from their jobs. Well, anyway, here's a picture from the end of that march. That's the steps of the U.S. Capitol. Now, eventually fears will subside and the Klan will decline. However, obviously we still have the Klan today. Now, African Americans, as I said, this was kind of the beginnings of the civil rights movement, and there's going to be a few African American leaders. One example is a man named Marcus Garvey. And let me show you a picture of Mr. Garvey. That's him. All right. He wanted to empower blacks economically. He created the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. He wanted economic self-sufficiency in black-owned businesses. He created what was called the Black Star Line, a venture where he sold $5 stock, $5 stocks to finance the deal. It was the first black-owned and staffed fleet of steamboats. A lot of working-class African Americans and others basically, invested in it. Now, it seemed like a good idea, but when you're the first to do something, you got to do everything right. Like if you're a woman in politics, you got to be like 1,000 times more qualified than the man. Same kind of deal with an African American business at this time. Well, unfortunately, this was not done very well. Poor management led to the end of the Black Star Line early on. Garvey was very militant. He was very proud of, quote, his blackness, which is fine. But this led to a lot of pageantry at the meetings. And he found himself at odds with W.E.B. Du Bois, who wanted Marcus to go. Marcus Garvey to go. Now, Garvey, his problem was he was actually pushing for black separation from the rest of the country. And while the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others wanted integration, Garvey and others like him were pushing for separation. How badly did W.E.B. Du Bois want Garvey gone? Well, he helped the FBI find evidence of fraud where Garvey went to prison for 4 years. Now, so that's kind of the beginnings there. Now, probably the best part of African American culture comes about in the 1920s as well. It is known as the Harlem Renaissance. It was the flourishing of black culture. Poetry and jazz were a big part of this. It will speak of the black experience. James Weldon Johnson wrote a poem called The Prodigal Son, which talked about the dangers faced by Southern immigrants to the North. Jazz comes out of this, probably the most uniquely American form of music. For some, it was a unique expression of music. For others, it was the devil's music. But then again, every generation of music, someone has called that the devil's music. And it's never been true except for the crap you guys listen to. Just kidding. It also talked about the seedy side of life, which some people didn't like because they saw that as the airing of their dirty laundry. Claude McKay, for example, wrote of crime, pimps, alcohol, and whores. So the idea here was that, basically nothing was off limits. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to read you a couple of pieces, a couple of poems from the Harlem Renaissance, and then I'm going to give you an extra credit opportunity where you can find your own piece of music or poetry or art from the Harlem Renaissance, and all you got to do is just in a half a page explain its meaning to me. So, the first one, and I'm going to have to pull up the other one on my phone because I forgot to. The first one is by Claude McKay, the guy who wrote about alcohol and prostitutes. It is called If We Must Die. And it goes, if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in inglorious spot, while round us barks the mad and hungry dogs, making the mock of our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe, though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their thousand blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave, like men will face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. That's Claude McKay's If We Must Die. Not the most cheery kind of thing. The other one I want to read is actually by a poet named Langston Hughes, who you're probably familiar with. It's called I Too Am America. Let me kind of pull it up here. It used to be it used to be in this book, in one of the editions of this book, and then they took it out. So, I Too Am America by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. So that's what you kind of got. And I apologize, I'm kind of stopped up today. That's what you kind of got with the Harlem Renaissance, and I hope that you'll dive in and find some poetry of your own. Now, this video is going to be a little bit longer than I like, just because, if I did another video now, it'd be about 10-15 minutes long, so we're just going to kind of, push through. So, let's talk about women. Let's see if I get myself in trouble right here. Women had just gotten the right to vote. Congress looks at them and says, maybe we should pander to women so they'll want to vote for us. That's politics. In 1921, Congress passed what was called the Shepard-Turner Act. It was money for poor mothers and to teach them about nutrition, hygiene, and give them prenatal care. It provided nurses for low-income pregnant women and other things that they might need. So this was a very successful program, and it helped a lot of women. But in 1929, they did not renew it. Why was that? Well, they found out that women did not vote as a bloc in 1929, so they didn't renew the plan. What they found is that women voted the way their husband or their dads told them to. And so they said, well, that makes it easy, so we no longer have to pander to women because women will just do what they're told. And there's still a lot of people who have that kind of attitude today. Now, here's the thing, and this is going to get me in trouble. Women make up more than 50% of the electorate. It is amazing they have put up with our bullcrap this long. These men are only in power today because enough women have allowed them to continue in power. The day that women realize the power they have at the voting booth will be the end of a lot of nonsense. Keep that in mind. All right, off my soapbox. This is also a time where the Equal Rights Amendment failed to get passed, though recently it just passed, maybe, sort of. We'll find out. Young women in the 20s were not as political as the women before them. Isn't that always the way? The ones who fought for it, their children are just kind of spoiled. Even Eleanor Roosevelt opposed the ERA. Why? Because, well, there was a concern women had won some concessions in jobs and different breaks and things. They were afraid that they would lose those things if the ERA was passed. Really kind of a stupid thing. But young women tended to be more concerned with working. In 1920, women made up 23.6% of the workforce. Companies began advertising to women because they found that women, while voting the way their husbands told them to, were making the purchasing decisions in the house. This is where I'm going to feel like I'm mansplaining. Margaret Sanger will fight for birth control during this time as well. In 1916, she opened the first birth control clinic in Brooklyn. She passed out flyers about contraceptions, saying that it was better to use contraception than to get a back alley abortion, which is true. The problem was there was something called the Comstock Act that had been passed in 1873, which made it illegal to even talk about contraception. By 1878, only New Mexico did not outright ban the distribution of information about birth rates, about birth control. Sanger was actually arrested and sent to jail for 30 days where she wasn't treated particularly well. Now, her thing was that she argued, and I don't know, seems right to me, she said women had the right to enjoy sexual intercourse just as much as men, and they should not have to worry. They should be able to use contraception so they didn't have to worry about getting pregnant. Now, by the late 1920s, we will begin to see nationwide birth control clinics. Now, the 1970s will be the next big thing in that, with the creation of the birth control pill, which probably gave women more autonomy over their bodies than they had ever had before. So that's birth control. Moving on. The 20s, and we're going to talk about this more when we get to the lead up to World War II, was also kind of a hopeful time that the world might actually be disarming. We will host what's called the Washington Conference in 1922, where we agree to limit our warships. We reaffirmed the Chinese open door policy. On November 11th, 1921, we opened the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, where, hopefully we won't have any more unknown soldiers thanks to DNA testing. We also cut the size of the Navy, and we agreed with others to respect the Pacific possessions of every country. We even passed what was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, which, you're going to love this one. It outlawed war. 63 nations signed it. It's kind of a weird thing, kind of one of those affirmational things. Japan and Germany signed it too, by the way. But it's one of those things, if you like violate it, how can you enforce it without violating it yourself? But it felt good. Americans wanted Europeans to pay their war debts to the United States. Europe was basically like, well, here's how we see it, guys. We paid in blood, and you guys paid in money. So shouldn't we call it even? And the United States was like, no, you're going to pay us. And that's one thing that's going to cause some economic instability. By 1923, you're going to begin to see Germany. It's going to hurt Germany's ability to pay their reparations. We're going to introduce what's called the Dawes Plan to restabilize that and change the reparation payment. We're going to get into all of that with the lead up to the war. It is going to, however, lead to more U.S. investment in Europe. Up until they believe that it's too saturated. So American investors will begin to pull out of Europe, and they'll see this nice, shiny new object called the New York Stock Exchange, which just kept going up and up and up until 1929, which we'll get into next time. And by the way, only Finland paid back what they owed us from World War II. That's why they're our very best friend in the world. So that's the 1920s. I look forward to your comments in the discussion board. I hope that we can have some good comments. Until next time, where we'll talk about the Great Depression and New Deal. I hope everyone is staying safe and staying well and not bored out of your minds. If you need anything, please make sure you let me know. If you're having any problems at all, I am here to help. Until next time, I'll see you later.